The seeds of isolationism were planted before Europeans even stepped foot on the soil of North America. As people fled Europe from religious persecution and holy wars, from the competition of nation-states, overpopulation, and for greater opportunity, they brought with them the isolationist destiny. The colonists desired to be free of outside government influence, and they were determined that their fate would no longer be tied to that of Great Britain. Thomas Bailey states in his book, A Diplomatic History of the American People, the American public is like a backseat driver. It knows in general where it wants to go, and it voices views which in turn lead to fundamental policies or objectives. And thus, if the ordinary American wants to know how he shapes foreign fundamental policy, all he has to do is look in a mirror. The colonists drove the doctrine of isolationism to become a foreign policy that would allow them to emerge as an independent and world power. Not only did European distresses dig the hole for the roots of isolationism to be planted, but also breathe life into this policy once it surfaced. The fight for independence eventually became a world war once the Franco-American Treaty of 1778 was sealed against the common foe, England. The chances were slim for the Americans to win. However, they had one major advantage: geography. The Americans were fighting on their soil. All they had to do was defend their land. However, the British had to travel nearly 3,000 miles on a deadly voyage to America, which caused great uncertainty. This geography distance and the vast ocean separating the two hemispheres played a great role in American foreign policy. Seen in Thomas Paine's Common Sense, he states, "Everything that is right or reasonable pleads for separation. There is something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. It is evident that they belong to different systems. England to Europe, America to itself." Paine's Common Sense did much to win the fight for independence and spread the fire of rebellion in the hearts of the colonists, as well spread isolationism. Paine could thus be said to have drafted the foundational document of not only American independence, but of American foreign policy as well. Paine created language to use to describe the situation of isolationist ideals emerging in the colonies. Once the nation emerged as an independent state, George Washington became the unanimously elected president. He was scarred by the Franco-American alliance that lasted for so many years. Not until the Neutrality Proclamation of 1793 did America state its aloofness from Old World disputes. Thus, during his presidency, Washington spread the isolationist tradition through his Neutrality Proclamation. Moreover, in Washington's farewell address, he aided in the emergence of isolationism as an American foreign policy, in which he instilled a spirit that inflamed the soul with fierce likes or dislikes for foreign countries, and continued to state, "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any of the foreign world, but we may safely trust to temporary alliances for extraordinary emergencies." This advice aligned with the isolationist policy surfacing in America. However, what is sound counsel of a young stripling may not apply later to a mature and muscular giant. After the War of 1812, the major product was a renewed and strong sense of nationalism, which likewise reflected in the shaping of foreign policy. The distresses of the Old World set the stage once again for an American diplomatic coup, and Monroe finally proclaimed his Monroe Doctrine, as he served as the mouthpiece of the United States in enunciating foreign policy, in which he incorporated two basic features: one of non-colonization and two of non-intervention. He proclaimed, in effect, that the era of colonization in the Americas had ended, and that henceforth the hunting season was permanently closed. At the same time, Monroe trumpeted a warning against foreign intervention. Monroe bluntly directed the crowned heads of Europe to keep their hated monarchical systems out of this hemisphere. This statement served as an initial warning to Europe, but later became a fundamental American policy rooted in the isolationist thinking. Isolationism spread in the days of colonial America, and from then on, this doctrine would be a concept in American foreign policy for years to come. This theory is what allowed the United States to emerge as an independent and world power, and its ability to defy British rule and to govern themselves through isolationist thinking. The defiance of British policy in the years of 1763 to 1775 would reinforce a sense of American political identity rooted in isolationism. The enforcement of the Sugar, Stamp, and Townshend Acts led to a hotly contested principle of self-taxation in the colonies. After the 7 Years' War, Britain emerged as one of the biggest empires in the world, and also with the biggest debt, about half of which had been incurred defending the American colonies. To justify and service this debt, British officials now moved to redefine the relationship with the North American colonies. Thus, British implementation of the Acts reflected the collection of dues in which would cover the devastating debt the British incurred during the war. However, the sovereign power of the British rule largely ignored the complaints growing within the colonies, and this taxing authority spurred the colonists to deny the authority of Parliament altogether and to begin to consider their own political independence. Thus, British policy and its implementation of rule propelled the isolationist outcry of America being separated from Europe. This colonial defiance of British rule solidified their isolationist thinking, allowing the U.S. to gain its independence and fill its role as one of the most dominant world powers. However, isolationism was never a stated foreign policy. Rather, its ideals were incorporated into policies such as non-intervention and non-involvement. For example, when wars start in one hemisphere, they can spread like fires throughout the world, such as the French Revolution. The French Revolution was a historic global revolution that sent tremors through much of the Western world and beyond. As the revolution not only had enormous political significance as the French attempted to claim themselves as a republic, but eventually turned into an all-out world war, as Britain was sucked into the contagious conflict which speedily spread to the New World and the young republic. Many Americans were eager to support French diplomatically and militarily because they viewed the French Revolution as similar to their own. But the United States was weak and had only really recently established its own institution of government. The neutral stance Washington adopted indicated a non-isolationist policy. This decision was militarily and economically driven, not based on a desire to remove themselves from foreign affairs. America did not cut themselves off from the rest of the world. They were involved with issues outside of the country and chose not to become involved with this war. European distresses throughout the centuries has had a continual effect on the Americas. The early competition of the world's nation-states used the U.S. as a pawn in the European game of chess. And after this, they yearned to be isolated from the European powers. Yet, the inability to remain in a total sphere of separation demonstrates the failure of a pure isolationist policy. Ultimately, the isolationism that developed in the colonial days aided in the emergence of America as an independent and world power. The colonists' ideals were rooted in isolationism and drove foreign policy, as seen in Thomas Paine's Common Sense, Washington's Neutrality Proclamation and Farewell Address, and the Monroe Doctrine. Finally, the colonists' defiance and isolationist thinking allowed them to win the fight for independence. Although pure isolationism is not wholly practical or possible, a few of the ideals, such as non-intervention and non-involvement, continue to be objectives of American foreign policy today.